Halfway through the worst dinner of my life, somewhere between the pot roast and a wedding toast I had to invent on the spot, I realized the husband I'd agreed to pretend to be had quietly been me the entire time. My neighbor had asked me that morning to play her husband for one dinner. Just one, in exchange for a month of free baking and her eternal gratitude. What she had forgotten to tell me, and, it turned out, forgotten to tell her dad, was that the imaginary man she'd been describing to her father for over a year was, detail for detail, the guy across the hall holding the gravy. I'm getting ahead of myself. Her father was still on the highway at this point in the story, which means I had several hours left to not panic, and chose, instead, to panic. My name is Sam Okafor, and I get up at 4 in the morning to make bread other people eat at 8. I run the early shift at a neighborhood bakery, proofing, shaping, sliding trays into an oven the size of a small car while the rest of the block is still asleep. It is unglamorous, flowery, deeply solitary work, and I love it more than I let on. I come home smelling like a warm kitchen. I'm usually asleep by 9, and my entire social life for the last 2 years has consisted of one person, which is exactly the problem I'm about to describe. That person lives across the hall, and her name is Nadia. We met because of a smoke alarm. About 2 years ago, at 5 in the morning, the shriek of it came through my door right as I was leaving for work, and I did what any reasonable man does at 5 a.m. I grabbed the fire extinguisher from under my sink and a still warm loaf from my bag for no logical reason and pounded on her door. She opened it in a cloud of smoke, holding a frying pan with something carbonized in it. Looking deeply betrayed by breakfast. "I don't need the extinguisher," she said, eyeing the loaf. "I might need the bread." I gave her the bread. We've been across the hall people ever since. Across the hall people are a specific category. We watered each other's plants. We signed for each other's packages. She left me notes in handwriting that got loopier the later it was written. I left her the heels of fresh loaves, which she pretended to find annoying and ate every time. She had a jade plant her mother gave her, a fat little succulent she'd somehow kept alive through 3 apartments, and when she traveled, I kept it watered, and when she was nervous, she pinched the dead leaves off it one by one, which is how I always knew something was wrong before she'd admit it. What we never did was name the obvious thing. 2 quietly single people, 2 years. 1 hallway, an entire shared vocabulary of plant watering and bread heels and 5 a.m. fire emergencies, and somehow we'd both decided, separately and with great discipline, that this was a friendship, and only a friendship. I had poor instincts about my own life. I had even worse ones about hers. The dinner came at me on a Tuesday, which is how the worst things always arrive, disguised as an ordinary Tuesday. She knocked on my door in the early evening, and the second I opened it, I knew something was wrong, because she had the jade plant in her hands and was pinching a leaf off it. The hallway smelled like the lasagna she'd clearly been stress baking. Her face was doing a thing I'd never seen it do. "I need to ask you for something insane," she said, "and I need you to let me get the whole sentence out before you say no." "Those are my favorite kind of sentences," I said. "Go. My dad is coming, Friday, to meet my husband." She closed her eyes. "Who does not exist?" "Because I invented him." I leaned against my doorframe. "Okay," I said slowly. "I'm going to need considerably more than that." The whole story came out on her couch over the stress lasagna, and the whole story was this. Her mother had died 2.5 years ago, and her father, who I knew only as a worried voice she'd put on speaker sometimes, had taken his grief and aimed all of it at her, calling constantly, trying to move her closer to home, lining up the sons of everyone he'd ever met, terrified of leaving his daughter alone in the world. And one night, exhausted, just to make it stop for 5 minutes, she'd told him she'd met someone. He'd lit up like she hadn't heard him light up since the funeral. So she kept it going. It got serious. Then, to close the topic permanently, to give him the one thing that would finally let him sleep, she told him they'd quietly gotten married. I was going to come clean, she said, pinching another leaf. Every week I was going to come clean. And every week he'd sound so much lighter, so much less afraid. And I'd think, next week. And then he called Sunday and said he'd booked a flight. Because he couldn't die without meeting the man who married his daughter, and he says things like that now, casually, since Mom and she stopped. I forgot to tell him there was no man. For a year I forgot to tell him. So now I either break my grieving father's heart on Friday, or I find a husband by Friday. And I said, am the husband. You're the only married-aged man I trust not to be weird about it, she said. One dinner. You play along, he flies home happy, and next month I tell him we're taking time apart and let the marriage quietly fail by text. You'd be doing a charitable thing. You'd basically be a volunteer. This is not a recommended life choice, I said. I'll do it. You'll do it? I will do it, I said, on the condition that you tell me everything you've already told him, because I am not improvising a marriage cold. And that's where it got strange. Because she pulled out her phone, where she'd apparently kept notes on her own lie like the responsible liar she is, and she started reading me the husband she'd invented. He's a baker, she said. I said nothing. He gets up before dawn. Dad loved that, said it showed character. She scrolled. He's quiet but funny once you get him going. He's the one who taught me to actually like bread, the heels especially. He fixed my smoke alarm after a small fire incident. She scrolled again, faster now, and her voice started doing something. He waters my mother's jade plant when I travel. He leaves notes. He has this laugh he does when he thinks something's dumb but likes it anyway. She stopped reading. The apartment got very quiet. She looked at the phone, and then she looked at me, and then she looked very hard at the phone again, like she could make the words rearrange themselves into a different man. Nadia, I said. It's a coincidence, she said. Too fast. So fast it didn't even slow down for the period at the end. You described me, I said. You've been describing me to your father for a year. I described a type, she said, pinching a leaf so hard it tore. A general kind of good man. It's a common type. It's a man who waters your specific mother's specific jade plant, I said. There is precisely one of those. She set the plant down too hard on the coffee table. We are not doing this right now, she said. We have a dinner to rehearse. Which is the most honest thing she'd said all night. Because what she meant was, we are absolutely doing this. Just not yet. And I let her have the not yet. Because I'm a coward, and because my own chest had started doing something I needed a minute to misunderstand. I told myself, lying awake that night before my 4 a.m. alarm, that it meant nothing. People build imaginary partners out of whatever's nearby. I was nearby. I was the closest available set of husband-shaped traits, that's all. Proximity, not preference, the romantic equivalent of grabbing the nearest jacket. She'd needed to picture a decent man, and her brain had grabbed the one across the hall because he was easy to picture. It wasn't about me. I built that explanation as carefully as I shape a loaf, and it held right up until her father walked through the door on Friday and shook my hand. Her dad was a wide, gentle man with grief still sitting in the lines around his eyes, and he gripped my hand in both of his and said, "So, the baker," and his voice cracked clean down the middle on the word baker. and I understood in that instant that whatever happened at this dinner, I was not going to be the one who broke him. The dinner was a high-wire act, and Nadia and I, it turned out, were a frighteningly good team on a wire. She'd hand me a setup, I'd land it. I'd start a story, she'd finish it. Twice we said the same word at the same time, and her dad beamed like we'd performed a miracle. The terrible, wonderful problem was that none of it felt like acting. Every memory I invented had a real one underneath it. When I described how we met, I just described the smoke alarm and the loaf, and changed 2 details, and her dad laughed so hard he had to set his fork down, and Nadia looked at me across the table, with something in her face that was not in the script. She talks about you. You know, her dad told me, while she was in the kitchen. On the phone. For a year now, same handful of things, over and over. The bread, the plant, the notes. He looked at me steadily. A father notices when a story doesn't change. It means it's the true part. He let that sit. I'm glad it was true. That landed. That sentence did something quiet to the whole apartment. Because he thought he was confirming the lie, and he had instead accidentally diagnosed it. And across the room I could see Nadia frozen in the kitchen doorway with 2 coffee cups, having heard every word. He flew home Sunday, happy, lighter than she'd heard him in years, and Nadia and I stood in her apartment among the dishes of a marriage that had never happened, not looking at each other, the jade plant between us on the table. For a long moment, neither of us said anything at all. She picked up the plant, put it down, picked at a leaf, and then made herself stop. The dishwasher hummed. The evening went gold through the window the way it does. It broke, because, for once, I decided to be the one who held the door open. Here's what we'll do, I said. We call it a favor. The best favor anyone's ever done anyone. Your dad's happy. The marriage gently fails by text next month exactly like you planned, and you and I go back to being the across-the-hall people who water each other's plants. And we never ever talk about the fact that the husband you invented was me. The door's open. You can walk straight back through it and I'll hold it and I won't say a word. She went still, not dramatically, just still. Then she said the first true thing, and she said it too fast, so fast that I knew it had been sitting behind her teeth for a year, waiting for a Sunday this quiet. I don't want the door, she said. I've been standing in front of that door for 2 years, finding reasons not to walk through it, and tonight I watched you not break my father's heart and I ran out of reasons. She heard it after she said it. I watched her hear it. Her hand went to the jade plant and gripped the edge of the pot. I didn't invent a type, Sam. I tried to. Every time I sat down to make up a husband for my dad, I just described you. Because you were the realest good thing in my life, and my brain refused to make up a fake one when the true one was eating my bread heels 11 feet away. I forgot to tell my dad it was pretend. But the bigger thing I forgot to tell anyone is that it stopped being pretend for me about 1.5 years ago. Nadia, I said. You can say it's just the dinner talking, she said, fast again. You can say it was a weird night and we got swept up and tomorrow we go back to normal, and you'd have every reason. I memorized which leaves on your plant are about to die, I said. So I'd know to come over before you got that look on your face. I've been doing that for 1 year. That's not a thing you do for a neighbor. That's a thing you do for someone whose face you can't stand to see go quiet. She made a sound that was half a laugh and half something 1 year overdue. So no, I said, it's not just the dinner. And then I crossed the apartment and took her hand off the edge of the pot and held it in both of mine the way her father had held mine on Friday, gently. Because the first time I touched Nadia like I meant it, I wanted it to be a thing I chose, and not a thing the night swept us into. And she stepped in close, and the jade plant sat there witnessing the whole thing like a small, smug houseplant that had seen this coming long before either of us did. We did not, in fact, let the marriage fail by text. What we did instead was call her father, together, 3 weeks later, and tell him a more complicated truth, that the man at the dinner was real, but the marriage hadn't been. That his daughter had loved her neighbor for a year and a half, and only admitted it because he'd flown across the country and forced the issue. There was a long silence on the line. Then her dad said, "So you're telling me my visit worked better than I planned," and started to laugh, and Nadia put her face in her hands, and the laugh on the phone was the lightest I'd ever heard a grieving man sound. 3 months later, I stopped pretending I lived across the hall and started pretending I still needed my own apartment, which fooled no one. A year after that, the jade plant lived in the window of what was now genuinely our place, and I learned that Nadia steals the bread heels directly out of my bag before I'm even through the door, and that under all the loopy late-night notes, she overthinks the quiet exactly as badly as I do, so we'd catch each other doing it, and have to laugh. Her dad called every Sunday, still, but lighter now, asking about the bakery and the plant and the man who married his daughter, for real this time, in a small ceremony where I made the bread myself. Years later, when people ask how we got together, and they ask, because I had to pretend to be her husband for one dinner is a story that earns its keep at any table, Nadia tells it her way, and I tell it mine. She says she invented a perfect husband to keep her father from worrying, and got so lazy about it, she just described the man across the hall, and the lie eventually got embarrassed and turned itself true. I say I spent 2 years memorizing which of her plant's leaves were dying, so I'd always have an excuse to knock, and called it being a good neighbor. We're both right. That's the thing nobody tells you about how two people find each other. Sometimes the truth is too big to say straight, so you dress it up as a favor. A lie. A one-dinner-only performance, and then the costume turns out to fit so well that you realize, somewhere between the pot roast and the toast, that you were never pretending at all. You were just rehearsing the real thing, in a disguise. You could survive. Nothing important had appeared overnight. It had simply stopped hiding behind an imaginary husband who'd been me the whole time. So, before you go, I want to know 2 things, and I read every answer. The small one. Have you ever invented a type, a fake someone, a person who didn't exist, and then realized you'd just described someone who was right in front of you the whole time? And the bigger one, the one I think about every morning at 4 a.m. How many people are already living the thing they're too scared to call by its real name? If this one found a soft place in you the way it found one in me, stay a while, subscribe, and I'll tell you the next one.